There are a lot of infamous and famous disturbing films. Films that are often mentioned include the Siberian Film, the Cannibal Holocaust, Human Centipede, etc. However, there are some that are more psychologically disturbing, rather than outright gory. For example, a film like Come and See, which is more of a war film rather than a horror or thriller, however features elements of those two genres. And in this video, I'd like to focus on an increasingly more infamous disturbing film, that being Lilya Forever. Now, the film isn't really graphic or gory and isn't overtly sexual, however, due to the severity of the subject it tackles, that is what makes it truly unsettling. The film's base plot follows Lilya, a girl living in the former Soviet Union. Where she's from is never specified. A troubled teen whose mother abandons her to move to America, which we see deeply affects Lilya as one of her first scenes of her talking about moving there.
Приезжай ко мне в гости в Америку.
In the film's opening scene, we actually see her battered and bruised running around the motorway looking scared. Her mother abandons her in a very well done scene in which you see a cheeky child who actually just really wants someone to love them. After her mother abandons her, her life just gets worse and worse. Her friend prostitutes herself, however, after her dad finds the money, he gives it to Lilya. However, in town, everyone believes that Lilya was the prostitute, thus her losing her friendship with Tasha, and being constantly harassed and accused due to these false allegations. Her mother gives up custody of her, which she writes to her in a very mean-spirited, brutal letter. Anne takes her apartment and forces her to live in a rundown small space, which still has the possessions of a former resident, an old man who recently just died. The only hope in her life is her friend Lilya, a young boy who loves basketball and essentially kind of lives with Lilya due to his abusive dad. The film makes it clear that he isn't really happy and is suicidal somewhat, which he points out several times, like trying to jump off a bridge and his talk about going to heaven to play basketball, as religion plays a heavy theme and big role throughout the film. The film truly takes a dark turn after Natasha's lies, as a group of boys who were introduced earlier in the film, wherein we see Lily invite them round with a kids' party and sniff glue, and those same boys constantly harass Lily, calling her horrible names, and eventually trick her into letting them into her home and violate her, whilst fighting off Lottie. Due to her situation, Lilya has to essentially pimp herself out in order to survive, which we see she does. And the first time she does it is very uncomfortable. However, she uses that money to buy Lottie a basketball to get back at the cashier, as early on in the film, she couldn't afford everything she wanted, but now she can.
Спасибо.
She continues to sniff herself out. After the second time, she meets a man named Andre, who offers to drop her off home and says he isn't trying to sleep with her. However, he does want to see her again, which she agrees to, and eventually become boyfriend and girlfriend. And in one of their scenes, we hear Forever Young in the background, which I think is where the title of the film comes from, as well as a scene in which she etches Lilya Forever into a bench. The song choice is beautifully haunting, given what comes after later on in the film. Andre says to Lilya that he can get her a job in Sweden to be a berry picker, which excites Lilya. However, Lilya doesn't trust him and advises Lilya to not go. However, she does. He says to her that he can't come and must visit his grandparents beforehand, and will meet her in a few days in Sweden. Whilst this happens, Lilya commits suicide by taking a handful of pills due to separation from Lilya, as she meets her boss at the airport. He takes her to her apartment and all seems well. She has a nice spacious apartment, a proper bathroom. However, she isn't able to leave the room as it's locked from the outside. She cleans the apartment up as it appears it's been taken care of by the boss. She sets up photo of the angels and sleeps on the couch. The next day she makes herself a nice warm bath. The boss then comes back, however...
Warm?
Andre misled her and sold her into essentially becoming a sex slave. The scene in which we see what she goes through are very disturbing. Without being graphic, as the actress who played Lilya was at the time very, thus the nudity in the film is very minimal. However, the film greatly shows the cruelty and depravity of what happens to her, thus it's shot from a point of view of her, thus it given the feeling as though you are the viewer are being violated, and is a very unsettling, given the fact that most of the people are middle-aged men. One guy in particular tries to get her to pretend she is his daughter, and asks her to do her homework, which she refuses to do, and we see that angers him, and keeps him presumably sodomizing her in a rather brutal fashion, giving her screams of agony. Now, whilst this might just seem to be an unrealistic film that's just trying to be depressing and disturbing for disturbing's sake, it is in fact inspired by a true story. A Lithuanian girl called Danguli Razali, who similarly was tricked into going to Sweden to a job and eventually forced into prostitution. She managed to escape to Malmo via escaping through a window, however she didn't want to contact the police. In Malmo she met an Albanian guy who also ended up gang assaulting her, and eventually a witness saw her jumping off a bridge to her death. She has also been mentioned several times in big events, such as the Queen of Sweden mentioning her name. Now the film doesn't quite go like that, exactly, as they wanted to take some artistic licensing and it isn't a biopic, as she doesn't meet an Albanian guy. However, a group assault does happen by the group of boys earlier on in the film. Now Wittek, the pimp, threatens Lily, whether hitting her, of course violating her. One scene she tries to escape, he truly gets angry at her, hitting at her, and he tells her if she runs away to the police will deport her. Which we see at the end, she has a chance to tell the police, but is scared to do so. Now, throughout the period of processing she goes through, she is visited during her sleeps by Vladimir in the form of an angel. And in probably the best scene in the film, which is to me an almost ethereal scene, Christmas Day, and he transports her to their old apartment rooftop and says he gives her the gift of the world.
Подарок на Рождество. Какой? Все это, весь мир. Дома, машины, улицы, ветер. Все это твое. Ты можешь делать все, что хочешь.
However, in a rather sad response, she rejects it and says the world isn't that.
Этот мир не такой уж и хороший. Вот я прыгаю и лечу.
Which she can't blame, as her life is just a total miserable tragedy. Wittek forgets to lock the door and she manages to escape, taking the film full circle and finds herself back in the opening scene. She goes towards a bridge and Volodya tries to convince her to not jump, however she doesn't listen and jumps to her death. However, the film kind of ends on a happy note, in which we see an alternative ending, wherein we see a much more positive Lilya helping her neighbours, rejecting Andre by saying you can't pick vegetables and berries in the winter, and the film ends on both of them as angels playing basketball on their apartment rooftop. Overall, the film I think is a very disturbing film, and does, like a good film should do, stay with, and it's rather haunting, which is made all the more depressing by the fact it's based on reality and still happens to this day, as the film illustrates how easily these people can get away with these horrific crimes, and that there are still people out there like Dangulite Razlite suffering this horrible porn abuse. Overall, a very illuminating movie, shedding light on one of the world's most evil, despicable crimes, and does so in a way that feels genuine rather than exploitative or virtual signal. A great but disturbing film.